I'm joined today with Mark Tooley, the president of the Institute on Religion and Democracy. How are you?
Good to be with you, Billy.
So you wrote a fascinating piece for World. It was a very simple title, Understanding Putin, which I think is something that the world right now is trying to figure out. They're trying to understand what is going on, the tragic events in Ukraine, the ongoing brutal assault on Ukraine. And as that is unfolding, there are a number of pieces of that puzzle that I think a lot of people in the West don't fully understand. And I want to get into that, into some of the faith issues that are at play. But I wanted to start with Putin himself. Vladimir Putin, do we know anything about his faith, what he believes?
Well, not with any certainty. Supposedly, he had a devoutly Christian mother and has worn a crucifix around his neck for much of his life. Certainly, he has embraced the patronage of the Russian Orthodox Church and used it to advance his own political purposes domestically and internationally. But that is a centuries long tradition for Russia, for rulers, whether czars or commissars or presidents, to use the Russian Orthodox Church as an instrument of the state.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was looking back at Time magazine when they interviewed him in 2007, and he was talking about, a very strange interaction. They asked if he believed in an all-knowing God or something along those lines, and he responded, "Well, do you?" And then he tried to sort of back out of it, that he didn't think it was right to enforce his views on others, and that by sharing them, it would force other people to sort of abide by those beliefs. And I thought that's such a strange position in light of what's happening right now, with what he's doing with other beliefs and perspectives that he's trying to push on people. So we really don't fully know, which is very interesting. But you wrote this line, and I want to talk about this as the jumping off point of maybe understanding some of this conflict a little better. You wrote, Russia is a longtime nemesis to the West precisely because of its version of Christianity. Can you explain?
Well, this is hard for Westerners to comprehend, but this dates back 1,000 years, the division between the Eastern Church and the Western Church. And Russia historically has seen itself as the heir to Constantinople and the protector of Eastern Orthodoxy. Moscow, from that perspective, is the third Rome after ancient Rome, Constantinople, then Moscow. And the West is the nemesis, theologically heretical, and politics adversarial, and invasions always come from the West. Decadence always comes from the West. The Russians are the guardians of the true faith.
That is an incredibly fascinating perspective. And for those who don't know, I mean, I've done a lot of coverage on China and looking at what's going on, obviously, with the church there. When it comes to Russia, how fused together is the government and the church there?
Well, the church has always been a very close partner and subordinate to the state in Russia. Obviously, after the Bolshevik Revolution, the communists tried to kill off the church and were not successful. And with World War II, Stalin realized the church could be very helpful to his purposes in terms of drumming up Russian nationalism. So the communists used the church for the next 45, 50 years. And the post-communist regime in Russia has used the church. And it's useful not just in terms of justifying its actions domestically, but because Eastern Orthodoxy is international, and the Patriarch of Moscow is a senior figure in Eastern Orthodoxy. So the Russians enjoy portraying themselves as the patron and protector of Eastern Orthodox Christians around the world. Certainly, we saw that in the Mideast as a partial justification for Russia's intervention in Syria to prop up the Assad regime there.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, and I wonder to what level when we talk about China, obviously totally different country, but looking at the ways in which China is controlling the church there, the rewriting of scripture, the rewriting of the Bible, this 10-year project in which they have a version of it apparently calling Jesus a sinner and saying that he stoned a woman, and you see sort of that control by the state where you have churches that have to be registered with the state. How similar is that dynamic in Russia? How different is it? How similar is it?
Well, obviously, similarities in that all authoritarian regimes are threatened by alternative sources of authority, including religion, and therefore try to stamp them out, or if they're more clever, to usurp them and draw them into their own purposes. But the distinction between Russia and China would be Russia is historically a self identified Christian country. Obviously, China is not. China tends to see Christianity as an alien Western force. Russian culture would see Western Christianity, Catholicism, and Protestantism as an alien force, but sees or connects core Russian identity with being Russian Orthodox.
So let's go back to Ukraine now and talk about this crisis and the church in Ukraine. Obviously, as a country, Ukraine now has had decades of freedom and autonomy, and this is now all being threatened with this Russian invasion. One of the things that has emerged in this conversation has been this question of how much is faith at the center of this? Is it a big part, the differences in faith between Russia and Ukraine? Is it a small part? And I guess, we can't maybe fully answer that, but to sort of start with, what is the tension that exists? If you could sort of take us through that between, Ukrainian Orthodoxy and the Russian church.
Well, part of the tension is that Russia sees itself as the senior partner to Ukraine. Ukraine has typically been under the Russian Empire or part of the Soviet Union. Obviously, it gained its independence with the collapse of the Soviet Union 30 years ago, but according to Russian lore, Russian culture, in effect, starts in what we now call Ukraine over 1,000 years ago when the pagan king Vladimir the Great, when he was marrying the daughter of the Emperor of Constantinople, it was stipulated by the emperor that he had to convert to Eastern Orthodoxy, and he did so and effectively baptize his country, having his people plunge themselves into a river so they could all become Eastern Orthodox virtually at the same time. And so Russia dates its origins to that conversion of Vladimir the Great.
And so, and this is maybe an intriguing question. We've seen some interesting headlines coming out of Ukraine. Obviously, a lot of people relying on prayer in the midst of everything that's going on. We've also seen at least one bookstore running out of Bibles because people were flocking to get Bibles in the midst again of this uncertainty. What is the spiritual, condition in Ukraine, and how do the practices of the church? Because I know they were granted essentially autonomy and freedom. The church there. How does that differ from maybe the practices in Russia?
Well, the religious practices in Russia are more repressive than they are in the Ukraine. The Russian Orthodox Church occupies the senior position in terms of religious life in Russia. Other churches are tolerated, especially those that pre-existed the Bolshevik Revolution. So, for example, I'm a Methodist, and there was a Methodist church in Russia before the Bolshevik Revolution, so it is tolerated in Russia. But other Christian churches and sects often have a very difficult time in terms of toleration in Russia. Ukraine is more open, and as you just mentioned, the Orthodox Church in the Ukraine just 3 years ago gained its autonomy, and its chief bishop was recognized by the Patriarch of Constantinople as having his own distinct authority, no longer subordinate to the Patriarch of Moscow, which obviously the Russian church and the Russian state did not like. So that was a point of tension.
So up until 3 years ago, the church in Ukraine was essentially beholden to spiritually, and I guess through regulatory action, essentially the Russian church.
It was, and there is still a part of Orthodoxy in the Ukraine that recognizes the authority of the Patriarch of Moscow, although I've seen that even he's a metropolitan, I believe, has denounced the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
So how much, and this is the challenging part, right? Because this part of the story, I think a lot of people don't realize that 3 years ago this happened. How much of that of the tension that led to where we are now do you think came in part from this? Do you think it was a small part? And again, I think we're probably trying to guess here at this point, or a large part of what added to the frustrations apparently that Putin had.
obviously as part of the larger narrative for Putin that Ukraine was being seduced and subverted by the West as it sought closer ties with Europe and the US and sought entrance into the European community. It would like to be in NATO. NATO is not very interested in inducting the Ukraine. So the fact that the Ukrainian church effectively detached from the Russian church and was developing its own independent relationships was part of that larger narrative that Ukraine was being torn away from its historic relationship with Holy Mother Russia.
Now, I would imagine, and we can't again, predict the future, but that if Russia comes in and takes over in Ukraine, that would put the Ukrainian Orthodoxy at risk, I would imagine.
Presumably, if Russia could gain full control over the Ukraine, it would like to reassert control by the Russian church over the Ukrainian church. That's going to be very hard to do. But the regions that Russia effectively seized a couple of years ago in the far eastern part of the Ukraine, those who are not Russian Orthodox have faced religious oppression in those regions. So that does not bode well for Russian control over the Ukraine for those who are not under the authority of the Russian church.
Well, Mark, I so appreciate you breaking this down because it's a really important part of the story, again, that I think people do not know. And again, as people out in the West, we're sort of watching this, trying to understand the different pieces of a very confusing puzzle. And I appreciate you taking the time to help us do that today.
Thank you. I appreciate your interest.